Hi, and welcome to another episode of Silver Goose Farm Stories. I'm your host, Mama Goose. We've been having some unusual summer storms the last couple of days, which reminded me of a big storm we had a few years ago when we were first setting up our homestead. It was around summertime, and about this time of year actually, and the weather was stiflingly hot for so long. This particular day, the forecast had promised a reprieve from the heat, but that would be followed up with some gusty winds. Or that's what the forecast said anyway. My husband was out of town for work, and I was manning the farm solo. It normally isn't that big of a deal. We just throw some flakes of hay to the animals, make sure everyone's water troughs are all topped off, and then occasionally an animal would get out of the electric fence because the dry summer ground just doesn't hold charge well. But by that time of the year, everyone's pretty docile, and the heat does not make for active animals, and they kind of go back to where they're supposed to be if I see them and tell them to shoot. By midday that day, the temperatures had dropped and it was nicely overcast, and the kids had spent the day outside jumping on the trampoline and stretching their legs after such a long stretch of merciless heat and being trapped indoors for so long. But as the day stretched on, the wind was picking up. It was more than just blustery gales, but I could see the trees whipping around like mad on the crest of the hill just beyond our house. Opening the door, I was met with this rush of wind, and our porch wind chimes were being flung around. We had a canopy set up as a makeshift milking shelter, and I was running down to the animals to try and tie it down, I guess was my thought process, even though there's nothing there in the pasture to tie it down with. Or maybe I thought I could take it down, I don't know. But I was walking in that direction. I didn't really have a plan. I just thought that it was the responsible thing to go check on it. But I was already too late, and the canopy had not only been blown away, but wrenched and twisted and mangled like the wind had some vendetta against it. And I noticed something else. The cows were gone. A tree limb or two had fallen on the fence wire and so generously released our herd somewhere. I could hear them, but couldn't see them, and I knew I wasn't going to get anywhere near them in the chaos of the storm. So I was running back to the house, yelling at the kids to get up to the top of the hill to close the gate at the driveway there, which in retrospect was a stupid thing to say because the gate, when it was there, was always broken, and no way could my oldest daughter move it, even if it had been on its hinges, when I could barely manage it as an adult. And I think my oldest daughter at the time was like 8 or something. It didn't matter because the wind was battering and howling right into my face, and the words were thrown back into my mouth the minute they left my lips. I watched my kids gleefully scampering into the house from the distance where I was midway between the cow pasture and the house, and they couldn't hear me. They didn't even know I was there, even though I was yelling at the top of my lungs. And trust me, I can be very loud. My frustration at not being heard while trudging back into the wind was replaced with terror and then relief because I suddenly watched the giant oak outside of our house whip around like one of those, the whacking, waving, inflatable arm signs in front of the car dealerships. And then there was this deafening crack as it split in half and fell. Thank God it fell away from the house and that the children were inside. I remember just my heart stopping for a second, and then the relief and oh, thank God that I said, that they were all safe. And I stood for a minute to watch the other half that was leaning over my bedroom window would also uproot itself, but thankfully it stood still, relieved from its previous maniacal dancing, because a great portion of weight had just been broken off of it. And this is the tree we took down in our farm workday podcast. With the house and the kids safe for the moment, I turned around and ran down the driveway to close our gate. Our driveway is about half a mile long, and I had a baby strapped to my chest. And on the walk back up the drive, I was hollering for cows that didn't respond, even if they could hear me. And I noticed that some branches had also fallen on the pig fencing, and I could make out a few ears sticking out of the hay in their pen, but it didn't look like the entire herd. So somewhere off into the wildness that is our property, there were pigs on the loose too, as well as cows. I was resigned then to leave it up to God. I couldn't chase the animals in perfect conditions. I'm not a runner. I'm not athletic. And our terrain is hilly, and there are trees and roots and creeks everywhere, and it was just not going to be good. And I most definitely could not with a baby on my chest and the wind blasting at me from all directions. So I called my husband once I was inside to let him know that we might have lost all our animals, but that the children and I are relatively safe. And he apologized that I was having to deal with all of this as if he was somehow responsible or had control over the weather, and assured me that things would be okay in that way that he does, and he'd be back as soon as he was able. And that more than likely because the animals were creatures of habit, that they'd be back in their fence once it got dark. Or at least that's what he hoped. The children and I hunkered down in the house, riding out the windstorm for the remainder of the day. More than once, watching dirt and leaves swirl into a funnel and die down, was I thankful to live in the hills and not in tornado country. We do have our own pattern of acts of God and crazy weather and danger, but tornadoes are not one of them. And in the evening, the wind had exhausted itself a bit and died down, and I ventured out to see a row of blinking innocent cow eyes, wondering where their dinner was. I begrudgingly gave them their hay, grumbling under my breath, and taking a small pleasure in locking them into their pen instead of letting them free on pasture at night, and then repeating the same process with the pigs. Morning brought a day of blinding sun and heat, and we discovered that anything that wasn't nailed down had been thrown around the yard and fields. But all the animals were back home and unmoved by my sour attitude with them, and as I began picking up the wind-blown artifacts on the farm, we heard the familiar crunch of gravel and the rumbling roar of Papa's truck as he returned home. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Silver Goose Farm Stories. Always thankful for you to take the time, and thank you for putting up with all the background noise as I'm trying to record this podcast during the day while everyone's awake. If you'd like to hear more about the farm, you can join us on our Instagram at Silver Goose Family Farm, or at our website, silvergoosefamilyfarm.com. Please leave a comment if you happen to stop by. We'd love to hear from you, and hopefully I'll be back with you again with another farm story very soon. Thanks. Bye.